It started with silence. Not a loud disagreement, not a slammed door, just the kind of empty quiet that arrives in the form of a group text that doesn't include your name. And when I first realized I hadn't been invited to Christmas dinner, I reread the messages twice to make sure it wasn't a mistake. That maybe I'd missed a thread, scrolled past an update, or misread a date. But no, there it was, plain as day. Christmas Eve dinner at our place, addressed to everyone but me. I sat in my small kitchen, coffee gone cold, phone still in hand, and stared at that exclusion like it had weight, like it had mass, like it could bruise. Because it did. I'm not one for dramatics. I don't need centerpieces or speeches or big gestures of gratitude. But I had never missed a Christmas with my son, not when he went through his rebellious phase, not when his father passed and grief silenced us for weeks, not even during the early years of their marriage, when holiday plans were always chaotic and everyone cried by dessert. I had always shown up, with casseroles, with patience, with quiet love. And now apparently that wasn't wanted. I didn't call to ask why. I knew who this came from. Madison, my daughter-in-law, has always had a way of making exclusion feel like elegance. She doesn't raise her voice. She raises expectations. The kind designed to keep certain people out. People who don't fit her aesthetic. People who remind her that my son once lived a different life, one that didn't include curated holiday tables and Instagrammable memories. I had suspected this shift was coming. Last year, she told me not to bring the green bean casserole, said they'd ordered everything from a Michelin meal kit. The year before, she gently suggested I skip the gift exchange since the kids didn't need more clutter. But this, no invitation at all, that was new. And it stung, not because I crave holidays, but because I'd invested so much in that house, in that family. They live in the home I helped them buy, a fact they forget often. Or choose to. I paid the down payment. I covered 3 years of their mortgage when my son lost his job. I never asked for repayment. I never even asked for thanks. But maybe that was my mistake, thinking kindness would always be remembered, thinking family would always mean inclusion. So I did what I always do when I'm hurt. I cleaned. I scrubbed my counters, rearranged my pantry, dusted shelves no one would ever compliment because I needed something to control. But as I cleaned, something hardened inside me. Not anger, not spite, just resolve. Because if I wasn't family enough to share a meal, maybe I wasn't family enough to pay their bills either. I waited until the house was still, until the dishwasher had finished its quiet hum and the wind had settled outside my windows, before opening the drawer where I kept the mortgage statements, the ones I still received out of habit, out of protection, out of a sense that someone had to keep an eye on things while Madison played hostess and my son tried to keep up with the life she curated like a Pinterest board. I pulled out the stack, paper-clipped and orderly, and flipped to the most recent month, due December 15th, already paid, by me. $2,984.73, withdrawn from my account with no thank you, no mention, no acknowledgement, just a quiet entitlement that had grown so slowly over the years I didn't notice until it became unbearable. I had been the invisible backbone of their financial life. When they bought that home, the realtor addressed every question to me. When the bank balked at their credit history, I offered my own. When the repairs piled up after the first storm, I covered them, quietly, efficiently. Because I believed that's what love looked like. Not anymore. I took a deep breath, opened my laptop, and logged into the portal. My name, still listed as guarantor. My email, still listed as primary contact. I clicked into the settings, updated the auto-pay, and hit canceled. Not paused, not delayed. Canceled, effective immediately. No payments would be made from my account after this month. I didn't need revenge. I needed relief, and sometimes those looked the same. The next morning, I went to the bank, sat across from a kind woman named Teresa, who wore her hair in a bun and didn't flinch when I explained what I wanted. I'd like to remove my name from their home loan, I said, or, if that's not possible, at least stop being the one who pays it. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. She handed me a form. I signed it with a steady hand, and as I slid it back across the table, something uncurled in my chest. I walked out of that bank lighter, not because I had punished them, but because I had finally stopped rewarding their forgetfulness. That afternoon, my son texted a photo. Madison standing in front of their fireplace, stockings hung with military precision, the caption, "All ready for Christmas." No mention of me, no invite, no shame. And I stared at it like someone might stare at a stranger's home, pretty but unfamiliar, glossy but cold. And then I smiled. Because in 20 days, that perfect home was about to feel a chill they couldn't decorate their way out of. The first call came on January 3rd, right after the holiday sparkle had dulled and the bills started arriving in stacks instead of ribbons, and I let it go to voicemail not out of spite but because I knew exactly what it was going to say. My son's voice, tight and confused, hovering on the edge of panic as he said, "Hey, Mom, looks like the mortgage didn't go through this month. Not sure if there was a glitch or—" And he trailed off, not finishing the sentence, not daring to say what he was really wondering. Had I stopped? I poured myself tea and listened to the full message without flinching, even when he tried to soften it with a joke, something about those holiday gremlins messing with our bank, as if it hadn't been him who let Madison draw a line in the sand and call it hospitality. I didn't respond. I let the silence speak, and 2 days later, another voicemail came, this time Madison. Her voice sugar-coated with a strain so thick it cracked by the end. "Hi," she began, bright and brittle. "We noticed the payment didn't go through, and I know you've always been so helpful with that, and I'm sure it's just a mix-up, so let me know if you need us to resend anything." I didn't, and for the first time in years, I let them sit with that need. On January 7th, my son called again. This time, he left a shorter message. "Mom, we're going to get a late fee. Just call me back, okay?" But I didn't, because this wasn't about punishment. It was about perspective. And sometimes the only way people see clearly is when the lights start going out. I went on with my day, did my grocery shopping, donated blankets to the shelter, fed the birds in the garden like I always did. And when I checked the mail that evening, there it was, an envelope addressed to me from their mortgage provider. Inside, a statement stamped in red, "Payment overdue," and beneath it, my name still listed as co-borrower, still tethered, still liable. I stared at the paper and felt that familiar tug, that ache to fix, to smooth, to rescue. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up the phone, called the bank, and asked for full removal of my liability. They walked me through the steps. Not fast, not simple, but possible. I began the process because they had chosen to exclude me from the table, and now I was reclaiming the deed. Not to punish, to protect. Myself, my peace, my pocket, because being generous should never mean being exploited. By the time February rolled around, the polite inquiries had morphed into thinly veiled demands, voicemails clipped and urgent, texts with timestamps that escalated from morning reminders to midnight ultimatums. And somewhere between, "Are you okay?" and "We need to talk," the truth finally slipped out in a message from Madison that read, "It's irresponsible to just stop supporting your family without warning." And I stared at that sentence, reread it twice, then a third time, letting each syllable settle like dust on a shelf I no longer felt obligated to clean, because there it was, laid bare, unvarnished, their entire framework of expectation, that I was not a person, but a resource, not a mother, but a bank with a last name. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because silence in the face of entitlement is not avoidance, it's clarity. And that week, I kept every receipt, every bank statement, every notarized form proving I had begun the legal process of removing myself from their debt. Not because I wanted to use it against them, but because I needed a paper trail strong enough to stand in the face of revisionist history. Because I knew what would come next. The guilt trip, the rewritten narratives, the calls to other family members painting me as forgetful or bitter or unwell, and I wasn't playing that game anymore. My sister called first. "They're saying you just bailed on them out of nowhere," she said, voice low with concern. "Did something happen?" I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said, "You mean besides being told I wasn't welcome at Christmas?" There was a pause, a sharp inhale, then silence. Because that was the first time she'd heard it, too. That I hadn't been invited, that I hadn't been there by choice, but by exclusion. "I didn't know," she whispered. "Of course you didn't," I said gently. "They never tell the part that makes them look bad." And I realized then how easy it had been for them to spin the story. Because I had always been quiet, always been the one who kept the peace. Always been the one who wrote the checks and bit my tongue and showed up smiling no matter how many times the seat at the table shrank smaller. But this time, I was done being small. This time, I wasn't keeping the story safe. I was setting it straight. When the mortgage company called to confirm the update on file, I gave verbal authorization, transferred final responsibilities, and ended the call with a thank you that felt like exhaling after years underwater. And that night, as the rain tapped gently on my windows and the world outside blurred soft and gray, I lit a candle not for bitterness, but for boundaries. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can say is nothing at all, and walk away anyway. The fallout didn't explode. It leaked, slow and petty, like a dripping faucet in the middle of the night you try to ignore until it keeps you up. And suddenly the silence between us wasn't awkward, it was strategic, because they weren't apologizing, and I wasn't pretending anymore. And for the first time in years, there was no pretense of civility to prop up the illusion that we were a close family who simply had different communication styles. I started hearing from people I hadn't spoken to in ages. Cousins who never called, old friends of my late husband, even Madison's college roommate from years ago, each one delivering the same message in different packaging. They're struggling now. Are you sure this is what you want? As if what I wanted had ever been part of the conversation before. As if they were struggling because of bad luck, not bad behavior. As if I hadn't spent 5 years making sure that house stayed standing while they hosted brunches, bought new decor, and took international vacations with my name still on the paperwork. I didn't respond to the messages. I didn't owe them a PR tour. Because what they didn't understand, what they never had to understand, was that I had done my part, quietly, thoroughly, without asking for recognition. I had been their safety net long before they ever admitted to falling. And now that the net was gone, the free fall felt like punishment instead of consequence. My son, to his credit, did try to reach out. Once. A simple text. "Can we talk?" No apology, no acknowledgement. Just a soft tap on the door of a room he helped lock from the inside. I didn't ignore it. I replied honestly. You let her disrespect me in my own home, on a holiday that built this family. We can talk, but only if it starts with the truth. He never responded. And that silence, it said more than any argument ever could. Because it wasn't just about Christmas, it was about years of erasure, of playing nice while being dismissed, of being expected to finance a lifestyle I wasn't even welcome in. I started redirecting that energy. Signed up for pottery classes at the community center, joined a local book club, made weekend plans that didn't revolve around waiting to be invited into someone else's life. I started living mine. I even reconnected with an old friend, Evelyn, who had retired to a quiet town by the lake and always said there was space for me if I ever got tired of being the strong one in the family. And for the first time in a long time, I was considering it, not out of spite, but out of peace. Because sometimes you don't need to burn bridges. You just need to stop walking back across them. 3 weeks passed before they finally realized the mortgage payments weren't going through, not because I'd told them, but because the bank sent a notice, formal and unmistakable, to the mailbox they never checked until it mattered, and suddenly the silence broke, not with an apology or a conversation, but with panic. Because consequences always sound louder when you're used to someone else catching them before they land. The first call came from Madison, voice tight and polite in the way only desperation can force, asking if I had accidentally missed a transfer, as though I were the one who'd dropped the ball instead of the one who had held the whole thing together in the first place. I told her I hadn't missed anything, that everything was now in their name, their responsibility, full ownership as she'd once demanded. She paused, then switched tactics. We've just been budgeting tightly, she said. And it's the holidays. It would mean a lot if you could help, just until spring. The same woman who banned me from her table was now asking for help with the roof over it. I didn't gloat. I didn't snap. I simply said no, then added, "It's good for you to know what it costs." She hung up. No thank you, no goodbye. And I sat there, hands steady, heart not angry but clear, because this wasn't about punishment. It was about finally removing the illusion of dependency dressed up as entitlement. The next call came from my son, and this time he was quieter, his voice rough, like he hadn't slept well. And he started with, "I didn't know it had gotten this bad," like their unpaid bills were the only thing that counted as damage. I didn't raise my voice. I just asked, "What exactly didn't you know? That she banned me from Christmas? That I was the one paying off your mortgage while you both bragged about independence?" He went silent, then whispered, "I thought it would blow over." That was the moment I realized he wasn't cruel, just cowardly. And cowardice, when it hides behind privilege, looks a lot like betrayal. I ended the call with kindness, not because he deserved it, but because I did. I said, "Take care of your home. That's what you asked for," and hung up. That night, I cooked myself a holiday meal for one. Baked ham, roasted carrots, a glass of wine, and silence that didn't ache anymore. I turned on the lights outside my house, the ones I used to put up for them, and smiled when my neighbor waved from across the street. "Your decorations look beautiful," she said. And for the first time in years, I believed it. Not because anyone else said so, but because I finally saw what my peace looked like with no one trying to dim it. The following week, I received a package on my doorstep. No return address, just my name scrawled across the label, in handwriting I recognized instantly as my son's, and inside was a framed photo of the three of us from years ago, back when holidays meant laughter instead of landmines. And scrawled on the back was a single line: "I'm sorry this is what it came to." I stared at it for a long time, unsure if it was guilt, manipulation, or some feeble middle ground where regret hides when it doesn't want to commit to change, and after a while I put the photo in a drawer. Not out of anger, but because I was done putting memories on display that didn't reflect the truth of what had been allowed to grow in their place. A day later, I got a voicemail from Madison. Not panicked this time, not even polite, just cold. "We didn't realize how much we depended on you," she said, "but don't think this makes you right." And that was the moment it all crystallized. The difference between needing someone and valuing them. They had always needed me. They just never thought they had to treat me like a person to keep receiving what I gave. So I stopped giving. Not out of pettiness, but out of preservation. My peace was not a reward they could earn back through guilt. It was a boundary I was finally strong enough to hold. I started cooking for one without sadness. Started folding my laundry without thinking of their towels mixed in. I started living in my own rhythm again, not waiting for their schedules or their scraps. And the most telling part? Christmas Day came, and I didn't cry. I didn't check my phone. I didn't replay old conversations in my head or stare at the empty chairs wondering what I did wrong. I simply got up, brewed my coffee, and sat on my porch, watching the world go quiet under a light dusting of snow. Later, I walked to the community center where I volunteer, served food, played games with kids who had nowhere else to go, laughed with people who didn't know my history, only my kindness, and in their company I felt something I hadn't in years. Wanted. Not for my money, not for my usefulness, but for my presence. When I got home that night, I passed the dark windows of my son's house down the street. Curtains drawn, driveway empty, no lights, no music, just a hollow stillness that mirrored the one they'd left in me years ago. And I thought, this is what happens when you mistake love for a utility. When you think warmth is owed instead of earned. When you take for granted that someone will always show up just because they always have. That evening I lit a candle, not in grief, in peace. And I let it burn slow, steady, uninterrupted, because this year the only flame I tended was my own. And it was enough. The first message of the new year didn't come from my son or Madison. It came from the mortgage company, confirming the final termination of their automatic payments, with a note thanking me for years of on-time processing, as if I were just another faceless account in the system and not the silent pillar holding up the roof they had taken for granted. I forwarded the notice to my son, no commentary, no sarcasm, just the facts, because at this point I wasn't trying to make a point, I was living one. 2 days passed before I heard a word. Not a call, not a text, just footsteps on the porch and a knock that didn't sound like entitlement. It sounded like uncertainty. When I opened the door, there he was. No umbrella, no coat buttoned, just my son standing in the cold with cheeks flushed and guilt hanging off him like wet wool. "Mom," he said, voice low, "can we talk?" I stepped back without a word, let him into the house he used to treat like a given. Now it felt earned. He looked around like it had changed, like the absence of him had rearranged the furniture. "I didn't know Madison didn't invite you," he said once we sat. "Not until after." I nodded slowly. "But you didn't ask either." He dropped his eyes. We thought maybe you were tired of the chaos." "No," I said. "I was tired of being treated like a relic." The words hung between us, heavier than either of us wanted to admit. "She thought you'd understand," he added. "That it was just one holiday. I met his gaze then. One holiday becomes two. Two become tradition, and before you know it, I'm a name on a card, not a place at the table. He didn't defend her after that. Didn't say another word for a while. Just sat there, watching the clock tick above the stove like it might chime a solution. "So what now?" he finally asked. "Now," I said, "we stop pretending I owe you softness after you traded my presence for peace." He blinked. "That's not fair." "Neither was 3 years of mortgage payments and being asked to stay quiet about it," I replied, "but I still did it. Because I believed in you." He rubbed his hands together, like he was trying to warm himself with the friction of regret. "I messed up." "No," I said. "You watched it happen. That's worse." There wasn't anger in my voice, just clarity, and that was scarier to him than rage. He leaned forward. "How do I make this right?" I took a breath. "You don't fix it, you rebuild it. But this time, I don't do all the heavy lifting." And that was it, not a demand, a boundary. He left with more silence than he came in with, and 3 days later Madison called. Her voice was tight, calculated, still polished, but now dusted with the desperation of someone watching a narrative slip out of her hands. "I'm sorry," she said, "for how things played out." I said nothing, because sometimes an apology isn't a question, it's a confession. I didn't rush to forgive her. I didn't rush to punish her either. I let her sit in the pause, in the uncertainty, because for once she needed to know what it felt like to be uninvited. A week passed, then another, and then I got a card. No glitter, no frills, just a photo of my grandson holding a sign that said, "Grandma, will you come over for Sunday dinner?" And I smiled, because that was the invitation I'd been waiting for. Not from the adults performing politeness, but from the child who still knew where the love lived. So I said yes, not to start over, but to continue, on new terms. If you've ever been erased from a story you helped write, let me tell you this. You don't need revenge. You need roots. Because real power isn't in slamming the door. It's in knowing you built the house they still have to walk through. And when they finally ask you back in, don't shrink. Don't beg. Just step in like you never left, because the truth is, they didn't lose you. They misplaced the foundation, and now they're realizing they can't rebuild without it.